So, thank you very much, Dr. Burns. That's great. It's now time to officially begin our program. I'm kind of snickering. I'm looking at the candy dish thing, wine glass, what have you, in the middle of the table. And I said to Lorna, what is that? And she said, I don't know. I assume it's for something later on. And all I can think of is that's kind of our starting place. That represents the austerity in New Brunswick. Those were meant to be full, weren't able to do it. So the whole replenishment of innovation and the creative process and all the hope and potential that will evolve as a result of the work being done today before, during, and after will hopefully fill those candy dishes and have them in an overflowing way. So that will be symbolic. Oh, no. Oh, there they are. Symbolic, okay? I'll notice there's a blue and a red one there. I guess you're missing a green one maybe, are you? Yeah, there. Okay. So, we are very privileged to have Nora Young with us today. Nora is the host and the creator of Spark, CBC Radio's national radio show about technology and culture. She was the founding host of CBC Radio's DNTO, or Definitely Not the Opera, where she often discussed topics related to new media and technology. Her work has also appeared online, on television, and in print. As a journalist, author, and speaker, Nora explores how new technology shapes the way we understand ourselves and the world around us. Her book, The Virtual Self, on the explosion of data about our behaviors, thoughts, opinions, and actions, has just been published by McClellan & Stewart. Nora is a casual blogger and a committed hobby podcaster. Please join me in welcoming Nora Young. Now, I'll take my symbols here, unless you need them as a motive.
I'll be all right. I took the easy way out. Thank you very much for including me in your conference. I'm thrilled to be here. C'est vraiment un plaisir d'être ici. One of the things I'm really interested in and researching more and more is this idea of the future of data and what happens when we bring together data with our flesh and blood, bricks and mortar communities. So I'm eager to learn more from you about the work you do, the challenges and the opportunities. We have time for a Q&A. I would love to learn from you then or during the break afterwards. Now, when I talked to Nick Scott about this conference and finding out a little bit more about what was going on and my goals for the talk today, he put it this way: what is the operating system if government is the application? So basically asking me to determine what the entire future of the digital era is. So thanks, should be easy. But once I thought about it, actually, this is a very clarifying way of putting this. What is the broader climate that governments and public services will be operating within? What are the limits and the possibilities? And what are the expectations that citizens, businesses, researchers, and community groups are going to have? So today, my goal is to sketch out what this new data environment looks like. An environment that's unfolding over, well, starting now, but unfolding over the next kind of 2 to 5 years, and then suggest some ways that creative partnerships and opportunities can come out of that. So I hope I can complement your thinking over the course of the conference. So the headline, if we think of the last decade as one of a turn towards open data, opening up the silos of government data, greater transparency, we can see the next challenge as Open Data 2.0, how smart cities, the Internet of Things, and the explosion of user-created data open up new possibilities for participation, for research, and for citizen engagement. Because we're not just seeing an increase in the amount of data produced. What we're really looking at here is a change in the culture of information based on what we might think of as a kind of a data boom. So just as the last decade brought us the information revolution of social media, Web 2.0 services like Wikipedia, YouTube, Facebook, etc., this new explosion of bottom-up data that's happening now will be at least as revolutionary. So when this data boom gets talked about, we usually use this buzzword big data, right? And when we're talking about big data, we're talking about data sets so large that they can't be managed by traditional computational tools. So for instance, Walmart processes something like 10 million purchases per day, and they look for correlations in the data so that they can plan. Or you might think about the NSA gathering 200 million text messages a day looking for correlations in the metadata. But I think that when we talk about data sets and big data this way, even when we use the term big data, we're kind of missing the human dimension of it. Because most of this data is coming from us, about us. We're actively and passively pumping out more and more data all the time. And if we treat it as this kind of abstraction of big data, I think we risk forgetting that the context of data is inherently political. It's produced by citizens, by clients. And the tools that generate the data exist in a political and a social context. So I want to start from kind of the simple and the personal and the down on the ground level by looking at how individual citizens are generating data, and then I'm going to put that into kind of a broader context to look at the bigger picture of this. So just to cycle through some of what we're talking about here, mapping the physical body, tracking the body's performance. Who here wears a fitness tracker of some kind, like a Fitbit or something? A few people. Who has an app on their phone that tracks things like the kind of exercise that you're getting? I do. So you probably know somebody who wears a tool to monitor their physical activity, even if you don't do it yourself, gathering metrics on how close you are to achieving your daily activity goals. And while this is mostly now people using them who are the least likely to need them, they tend to be fit, they tend to be young, sales of them are exploding. Sales of wearable, dedicated trackers increased 150% year on year from 2014 to 2015. There's been this huge boom in the health sector and in health and fitness. At the same time, there's been speculation that all of these dedicated fitness trackers will be overtaken by smartwatches offering similar monitoring functions. But the point is this, that technologies that were once used in medical contexts or for elite athletes are now everyday tools for weekend warriors or people just curious about their bodies, thanks to cheaper electronics, the smartphone app boom, and cheap data storage, which is a trend that we're going to see all over the place. So that's happening with physical health, but it's also happening in the mental health context, as with something like Ginger.io. So monitoring not only self-reported data like mood, but using the smartphone as a sort of passive monitor to measure things like metadata from phone calls, accelerometer data to track things like how much physical activity a client is getting and how much social connection she or he has, all as a way of trying to predict mental health and well-being. And while now a lot of these tools seem like motivational tools or novelties or things that outliers are using, what happens when different types of personal data gathering tools start to come together? Apple's very much getting into the e-health world with its Health Kit, which is designed around this idea of pulling that data together with an eye to making it more useful. And additionally, Apple's come out with Research Kit with the goal of being this sort of neutral channel that'll pass on anonymous health data to researchers. So it's early days, but we're already thinking about what can happen with consumer-grade technologies. And I want to put a little pin in that. I'm going to come back to that because I think it's important that we think about who is storing our data and why. These kinds of things that are currently at the embryonic level are really bellwethers for where things are going in the future. And in addition, what I find so interesting about this is how many people seem to be open to sharing what could be very sensitive data. When you look at mental health data and physical health data, this is potentially very sensitive information. So another area we might think about is tracking your experiences of the world around you. So customer service reviews on something like Yelp, tracking the TV shows and the books you read. We register our responses to movies that we watch on Netflix, not necessarily because we particularly want to track, but because it gives us better movie recommendations. Or think about status updates, or simply the copious photos and videos as our online experience becomes increasingly visual. 8 billion videos a day are viewed on Facebook alone. 6 billion are viewed on Snapchat. And until recently, all that video and still image content has relied on people tagging images with relevant information, or on the presence of helpful metadata like location information. But as facial recognition technology takes off, more and more of those visual images will be identified and tagged. There's incredible competition in the mapping space as more and more of our online activity takes place using mobile devices, and more of the data that we're producing is tied to actual physical locations. We're increasingly being encouraged to annotate the physical, geographically specific world around us. Mapping is rapidly going from an expensive, hierarchically curated affair to a state where at least some mapping is cheap to free. And it'll be interesting, we're going to talk afterwards in the panel discussion about some of the implications of mapping and geographical data becoming more open. So something like OpenStreetMap is an open source tool that lets people map their own communities. So in this screen grab, this is Kibera in Nairobi. It's the largest urban slum in Africa. OpenStreetMap, which lets anybody annotate the space around them, literally let the residents of Kibera put themselves on the map. So something that was not done before because they're informal communities without, ordinary street numbers and things like that. Using this kind of open source technology, you could actually create a usable, geographically centered map. So we're starting to see that kind of thing happen a lot more, not just the online experience over here and the flesh and blood world over here, but this overlaying, this braiding together of the physical and the digital in real physical space. So when we look at wearables like the Apple Watch or the Fitbit or whatever, a lot of the data capture that we're doing right now is opt-in, right? I decide I'm going to count my steps or whatever. But as we go forward, capturing data about ourselves is going to be more complete and more automatic than ever. So you might think about something like this. This is the narrative clip. It's a little thing that you wear on your shirt. And the only decision you really have to make about the narrative clip is that A, you're going to buy it, and B, you're going to put it on your shirt. Because after that, it takes a picture of what's going on around you every 30 seconds, all day, every day, and gathers all of that data together. So you don't actually have to consciously make any decision, hey, I want to take a selfie, or I want to take a picture of the room here and post it to my site. It's automatically being captured every 30 seconds. And who knows whether that's going to take off beyond the sort of quantified self niche. But I think it's an important example of a turning point, which is what happens when data goes from being consciously and strategically captured in the way that anyone who has a pedometer or kept a food diary could have done it, a generation ago, to the default being that things are simply captured and you need to choose not to capture it. So wearables suggest the increasingly personal, even intimate use of these data gathering tools. And down the road, implantables are set to explode. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, actually, and one of my fellow panelists had a chip installed right there on his hand so that he could use it to unlock his apartment door. Never worry about losing your keys again. So that's one example of how things are moving in this direction. Another example that we might think about is Proteus. Proteus is a company that makes what they call digital health, digital medicine. And so what that works is, if you can see on the illustration from their website, is there's a tiny sensor on every pill that you take. And what happens is you take the pill and the sensor tracks that you've taken your pill, and it also tracks the spread of the medication through your body and communicates that to a little thing that you wear on your lapel, which then can be connected to an app that you and your doctor have. And so the reason that they're doing this, obviously, for practical reasons, is that there's a lot of problem with people not complying with taking their medication. And so it's a way of monitoring, are you taking your medication? Are you taking the right medication? Is the dosage right? But it also raises a lot of questions about, what's normative, about being in good health, about being in good shape, and about the limits to sort of privacy and free will when it comes to engaging with some of these tools. Now, I should say that Proteus requires the explicit permission of people who are using it in order to do all this tracking. So healthcare is the principal area right now where we're seeing growth in wearables, ingestibles, and implantables, but who knows how many other contexts we're going to see it in the near future. And of course, this kind of automatic capture can be kind of creepy or uncanny sometimes, even if we've agreed to it. So for example, I have an Android-based phone, and I derive a lot of value from its location awareness, but it's still creepy to look up your Google location history and see that Google knows that I was having dinner at the Water Street Cafe in the Gastown neighborhood of Vancouver on November 13th. So every once in a while, even though we know this data capture is going on, we're sort of shocked by it, right? It seems uncanny or creepy or weird. And that's why sometimes, as individuals, our reactions to our own privacy are not entirely logical or rational. They're emotional, right? So the point in indicating all this kind of stuff is this: as our analog world becomes more digital and more networked, more internet connected, the more digital data is captured. And the more we become a world of passively generated data, so-called data exhaust. It's in the character of digital technology that it can do this. So if I read an e-book, the e-reader knows how the book is being read in a way that the paper book does not. And that's not because there's a particular interest in surveilling me. In the case of the e-book, it needs to know where you are in the book just in order to return you to where you left off the night before. Or Netflix knows what you're watching in order to return to where you were the last time you were watching and to recommend movies to you. So as our analog world moves into this more digital framework, the more digital data is captured. So think for a moment about this impact in your own life. Think back to, say, 2005, when you were reading paper books and keeping track of your appointments on a paper calendar, when your phone was pretty much just something that you talked into and not something that knew where you were with incredible precision. The amount of data that we generate in our own lives is truly astonishing, and it's only set to really increase from here. And increasingly, that data that's gathered is not just used retrospectively, it has predictive power. So at the moment, Google Now on my phone will tell me how long it'll take me to get to home at the end of my workday, not because I've asked it or because I've even told it where my home or my workplace is. It just intuits that based on the pattern of my behavior. Monday to Friday, I leave one place at around 5:30 p.m. and I go to another place where I generally spend the evening and night. Ergo, she's leaving work and going to home. So this is an example of what's called contextual computing, and it's going beyond location to all sorts of inferences about what's likely to be useful to you based on your past behavior and based on your context. And so the final connecting piece here in this data boom world is the Internet of Things. So beyond what we carry with us, beyond what we've ingested and had implanted, as we go forward, we're going to start to see more sensors everywhere, collecting data about everything from where the next city bus is, to air quality, to numbers of people passing through a given location. So to use a simple example that exists right now, you can already have something in your house like the WhyThings bathroom scale, which is Wi-Fi enabled. You step on it in the morning and it automatically communicates your weight over the internet to your online profile. Hooray, I guess. This is the sort of embryonic world of the Internet of Things. According to an October story in Ars Technica, by some estimates, within the next 5 years, the number of devices connected to the internet will outnumber people on the planet by over 7 to 1. So another example that exists right now, you can buy a smart TV with sensors and speech recognition so that you can give it instructions. Increasingly, devices, smart objects, and sensors that are connected to the internet are going to be the norm. Connected to the internet and connected to each other. Earlier I referred to speech recognition and image recognition. Now for many years this was the classic hard problem for artificial intelligence. Computers were just not very good at understanding images or understanding what humans were saying. But things are starting to turn a corner in this respect, and very quickly. In your own life, you might have noticed how your smartphone's voice recognition using Siri or Google Now or Cortana, how much that's improved over the last while. This is thanks to an approach that's called deep learning. It's an approach to artificial intelligence that's been around for a long time, and it basically involves using software to model the neural networks of our brains and sort of create an artificial approach to mirroring the way the brain's neural networks work. Speech recognition has advanced extremely quickly, and image recognition is moving this way too. So the same technologies that make it possible for, say, Siri on an iPhone to recognizing you asking, what's the weather in Fredericton this coming weekend, is making it easier for computers to recognize what's in photographs and speech. So let's think about that for a moment. At the same time as we're putting out ever more images and speech into the infoverse, our technologies are getting better at listening and looking at what we put out there. So we have all these small pieces coming together, right, which on their own do not necessarily sound like a lot, but when they come together, self-tracking is this kind of cultural phenomenon, the gathering and sharing of data that we all like to do on Facebook and Twitter and so forth. Mobile technologies like phones, tablets, e-readers, smartwatches, narrative clips, and so forth, and down the road, implantables and ingestibles. 3, the ubiquity of maps that tie data to actual physical locations. 4, smart objects and internet-connected sensors that communicate awareness of their environment. 5, the ability to search all that data through text, images, and audio. Thus, we have this very different information environment than what all of us grew up in, right? I think of it as a data map, this highly fluid, increasingly public, location-based set of information that's a digital doppelganger of the world around us. So if we had a revolution in information when it became possible to search things on the internet, what does it mean when it becomes effectively possible to search the real physical world around you, right? When data is embedded in all of the things around us and our environment, in fact, becomes searchable. This is the world of the smart city that people talk so much about. But it's about so much more than making the buses run on time. For so much of our history, we've operated in this context of a lack of access to data, to information. Our political, our social, our business, our research institutions have all been built around what to do when there's a scarcity of information, right? I mean, think about something like the person lecturing in an educational setting. That goes back to the universities of the Middle Ages, and the reason why the professor used to stand up at the front and lecture to people, and they would take notes and transcribe what he was saying, is because books were an incredibly scarce resource. To make a book that was written out by a monk might take a small herd of sheep, or flock of sheep or herd of cows, just to make one large book. How different are we now in our current data environment? And yet we still have so many of our ways of working and playing and connecting and governing, doing business, meeting, based on these kind of cultural norms that were created, in some cases, a very, very long time ago. So we can think more deeply about what can change in the culture of those institutions once data is plentiful. The revolutions of Web 2.0, social media, and open data have really just scratched the surface. So if you think about how far you've come in your work practices over the last, say, 10 years, we're getting ready to hit sort of hyperdrive now in terms of the changes that is implied by greater access to data. So it's going to change a lot of things, a lot. It's opening up tremendous new sources of data for researchers, urban planners, startups, governments, decision makers of all stripes. So that means there needs to be smart thinking about privacy, about collaboration, about optimal uses of all this data. But here's what I want to stress. It's at least as important from a cultural point of view as it is from a technical one. The change in our relationship to data is not a one-way street that only affects people who are in the business of gathering and analyzing data. It's about what people expect from their data and how we adapt our institutions to both make use of data, but also respect citizens' engagement with their data. So in your work, you've been trying to figure out what open data means for the work you do, how you meet developers, businesses, and citizens' desire for open data while protecting sensitive information, metadata, and so forth. We're about to get into a much more complex environment with data coming from all these different sources. So you're the ones who are going to come up with the truly exciting possibilities for all this data. And I really believe that it's people who are doing what you do, who are engaging with things on the ground and trying to figure out novel solutions, who are going to come up with the truly exciting possibilities. But I want to sketch out, maybe just to get the ball rolling, some embryonic senses of how we might think about working within this new environment. So does anyone here have a Nest thermostat? A couple of people? So you probably know Nest makes these internet-connected home thermostats and a few other devices for home security and control. And because it's internet-enabled, you can control the Nest from an app on your phone. Now, they ran this intriguing project, a pilot project in Austin, Texas, where I guess there are enough people with these smart thermostats that it made sense to try this out. So what they did was, with Nest users' permission, when it was hot and there was too much pressure on the power grid on the air conditioning, due to air conditioning, the city could turn down some of the Nest thermostats remotely without their users' permission, except for the initial signing up to do this. And why did they do that? Not to make people very, very hot, but they did it because the Nest is equipped with motion sensors. So the city could choose to turn down the thermostats in homes where it can be pretty sure that no one's actually home because there's no motion being detected. which is neat as far as it goes, but we're seeing plenty of examples of how this would work in the future. And this is the whole premise of smart cities, right? That given real-time information about how your community, your province, your country is interacting with the instrumented Internet of Things world around it, you can envision all kinds of smart plans. So if we know what people in New Brunswick are doing, where they're going, how they're behaving, how they're using the communities they're part of, we can start to make those communities more responsive to the needs of the people who live there, like making transit more responsive and using public resources like energy more efficiently. Now, obviously, we don't want to know where Nora Young in particular is. We want to know where people in the aggregate are. And it's not just a sort of developed world frill either. In the developing world, which is where most of the world's cell phones are, anonymous cell phone data has been used to great effect. So just one example again, researcher Linus Bengston has analyzed anonymized cell data to track and predict the spread of cholera in Haiti after the earthquake. Not quite in real time, but within 12 hours, which is pretty astonishing, an astonishing ability to react on the fly in conditions precisely where other information is scarce. And that's just with ordinary phones, not even with smartphones. So people in the development and tech field talk about the next billion or the next 2 billion, which is what happens when the number of people accessing the internet goes from its current 3 billion up to 5 billion, most of whom are going to be accessing it on phones over mobile networks. Smartphone use is predicted to reach 80% penetration globally by 2020. So the data boom is going to happen globally, not just in the developed world. So that idea of like the Nest thermostat, for instance, or tracking the spread of cholera is what we can do with the data exhaust that I talked about, just that data that comes off of us in virtue of using our digital tools. But what happens when we actively try to harness the cultural trend towards self-reporting? The same trend that makes us share photos of what we had for breakfast or the beautiful scene that we saw around us or update our Facebook profiles with status reports, but in the service of something more significant, more culturally powerful, more economically powerful, more politically important. Anyone here heard of Ushahidi? Ushahidi is Kenyan technology. It's an open source platform that was created in the wake of the post-election violence that happened in Kenya, the election before this one, so over 5 years ago. And what it let people do was send text messages reporting episodes of violence, which would be automatically plotted on an online map as a way of bearing witness to what was going on, and presumably also to see where the violence might be headed. It was enormously successful as a tool because it took advantage of what people were already doing. Cell phones were already very widely distributed in Kenya. People were used to the SMS technology, and people are used to communicating, right? We're social animals, we like to communicate. So this was an enormously successful tool, and it's gone on from there to be used in all kinds of crisis mapping applications. So this is an example, Syria Tracker, that was tracking episodes of violence and conflict in Syria, but it's been used all over the place to monitor elections in India, Lebanon, and Pakistan, to monitor extreme weather events in the US, and more. And it's not some top-down big program either. It was literally the idea of 3 bloggers who had a good idea. 3 people. And as of this spring, this good idea has been used about 90,000 times in crises all over the world. 3 people, incredible impact. So these are some simple, even quirky examples, but there are a great many of them. And people who talk about big data often talk about the role of big institutions in using enormous data sets. The governments will look at air quality and live commuter data to build smart, responsive cities, or that health researchers will find correlations in huge data sets that will lead to new treatments. And that's absolutely part of the big picture of what big data will mean. But there's an equally important role for interesting projects at all levels. Projects that take advantage of the power of these sorts of partnerships with users, clients, businesses, government, and citizens. And what these few examples show, though, and what I want us to keep in mind, is what happens when we think of data as an opportunity for partnerships with people. Because that's what they all share, right? It's all those people in Austin, Texas thinking, I think this is a really good project, so I'm going to give the city the power to turn my air conditioning down when I'm not at home. Or I'm going to report on what I'm observing around me about violence and conflicts or about extreme weather events, right? It's thinking about people as data subjects, not just passive sources of data that we're going to, hoover up the data from. So I hope I've convinced you that there's potential in all of this tracking and sharing of information that we're doing, But there are also significant challenges in moving into this big data world. I came across this great story recently by Dan Hill, not beloved light rock singer Dan Hill. This Dan Hill is a writer and a thinker about the smart city. And he recounts this story that he learned about ancient Egypt, where basically the whole society was connected to the cycle of the Nile's flooding, right? It was a big part of their agricultural cycle. And there was a whole priestly caste and a hierarchy that was created out of this mysterious process of divining when the Nile would flood. Rituals and mythology about the nature of the Nile's floods. However, what Dan Hill reveals is that what the priests in that highly hierarchical situation were actually doing was relying on technology. They weren't using mystical powers at all. They had these measuring devices hidden in the temples, a technology that tracked the flow of the river and tracked it to historical data about the flow of the Nile, enabling prediction. And the reason why I think that story is interesting is it's a particularly stark example of the way data can be used as a kind of source of power in a negative sense, right? Not in a power of partnership, but in the power of hoarding data in reinforcing one's hierarchy and authority. When we think about the future of data, we have to think about things like access, transparency, what we're measuring, and why. These are at least as much political questions as they are technological ones. And this is overwhelmingly why we need smart public sector actors, not because they're necessarily technicians, but because you, have a lot at stake and a lot of expertise in the context in which these new tools will be used. So it's the social climate around the technology that needs engagement and smart thinking as much as it is about the technology itself. So another thing we might think about around how we use this data is how authoritative it is and how authoritative it needs to be. So there was something like 20 million tweets that happened about Hurricane Sandy in the days following that event. And you know there's useful information in that data, but how do you find it? How do you know what's reliable? These large data sets, big data, are notoriously what's called messy. So when is that all right? Clearly in our Haiti case, it's good enough because it's better than nothing, which is what the alternative was. But thinking strategically and creatively about when are the appropriate times for this kind of big, messy data versus the times when you need highly structured data is important. We also have to think about some of these questions as ethical questions. What kind of data are we choosing to collect? And as people in this public sector, what are the values embedded in what's collected? For instance, it's not neutral that Facebook suggests users add details to their profiles, like the TV shows they like or the bands they listen to. This is excellent data for creating marketing psychographics. There's politics embedded in those kinds of choices. I don't know if anyone heard my show yesterday, but we talked about a really interesting example of smart thinking about data underway in Chicago. It's called the Array of Things. And it's just starting to be rolled out in the new year. It'll be a series of sensors that will gather data on things like foot traffic, air quality, traffic patterns, and more, which will be used by researchers. But they've also designed it specifically so that it can be made open and freely accessible to developers who want to build applications using the data, and to regular citizens, importantly, who want to do something like plan a route through the city that's not going to increase their asthma. And that means that they've thought in advance about what kind of data they collect and record and how they're going to make it not personally identifying from the get-go. It's baked in. The political values are baked in. It's not something that gets figured out after they've brought in the technology. From a design perspective, we have to think about the design decisions that encourage participation and equal access. For instance, if we think about the design decisions that differentiate Facebook and Twitter, on Twitter, you can follow people without having them reciprocally follow you back, compared to Facebook, where you have this sort of friending relationship. I have no idea why they made that decision, but there are a lot of consequences to that once we started to see Facebook and Twitter grow into platforms for sharing news. So here's an example that makes the point. This is a screen capture made by the technology writer Keith Alexander on the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic in 2012. It's a bit blurry, but basically that's the beginning of a whole screen capture of people who only just realized at the moment that the Titanic actually happened and wasn't just a movie by James Cameron. Charlotte at the top says, "Is it bad? I didn't know the Titanic was real. Always thought it was just a film." Yes, Charlotte, it is bad. So, I mean, it's, poor Charlotte. Uh, so, you know, that's an example of that, right? Heaven help you if you're following Charlotte to get your news from, right? But because Twitter has this sort of open platform where you don't need to have that reciprocal relationship, you can say, hey, I better start following some people who know a little bit more about history than Charlotte, and you can do that. So that's an example of a design decision that was made early on. Again, who knows why, but it had a huge impact on things like democratic access to news and information. Privacy. You knew I was going to come to this sooner or later, didn't you? There are lots of core issues with respect to digital and privacy, but one that probably doesn't get as much attention as it should is what happens when we start to have hundreds or thousands of data sets about us, combined with the way digital technology makes it easy to take things out of one context and put them into another. For instance, here's something that I learned about a little while ago at a conference. This is technology called gigapixel. It's Vancouver-based technology, and this is a photograph that was taken outside CBC Vancouver before the final Stanley Cup hockey game that ended with the Vancouver riots. And actually what this is it's a sort of a composite. It's stitching together something like 200 photographs together to come up with this enormous image. Now, if you're in that crowd, you almost certainly don't think you're in private, but you probably think you're anonymous just in virtue of the fact that there are so many people there. But thanks to this type of technology, you can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in with really not much loss of quality. And because we have this desire to do our status updates and to share, what they encourage you to do is to log in to Facebook and tag yourself and your friends in this image. So see the guy with the little blue dot over his head, you click on that blue dot and it takes you to the person's Facebook profile. So that's another implication of the way we like to tag and share, right? And that's even without using facial recognition technology that, as I alluded to, is improving all the time. This is in the nature of digital technology, the ability to connect things from different data sets. And our privacy rules were mostly created at a time when protecting personal data meant protecting small, very important pieces of information, your credit card number, your social insurance number, your birth date, and so on. But what we need to get our heads around now is what privacy means, not in the context of a small number of very important pieces of data, but large amounts of data that maybe on their own seem completely trivial or uninteresting or unimportant. And there's an emerging consensus that anonymizing data, when there are loads of other data sets they can be connected to, is not reliable. So again, this factors into how we make data accessible but also safe. So consider the chill factor of this from the New Yorker. This is from when the protests were going on in Ukraine early in 2014. People who were at a massive demonstration in Kiev who took out their phones suddenly saw this message on their phones. So think about that very same idea that the data that gives us so much freedom on the one hand can be used to track us in a negative way in the context of in this case, in context of an encroachment on people's right to free assembly. So that's a specific political example, but we can imagine all sorts of unintended privacy questions. It's already the case that insurance companies are experimenting with drawing information from people's social media accounts and offering insurance breaks for people who use fitness trackers or agree to have their driving monitored. The potential for sensitive health data to be used in a discriminatory fashion is scary and obviously needs rigorous protection. So I hope I've given you both some optimism that there are all kinds of exciting things we can do with this explosion of data and also a cautionary note about what some of the concerns are. And if we think about the near future as Open Data 2.0, what might you want to bear in mind as you conduct research, design programs, work with citizens and stakeholder groups? Well, the thing about this new data world is that it's going to be an informationally chaotic environment, incredibly fast, but not always super reliable. Within that world, we need what I've taken to calling credibility hubs. The pre-internet world of ivory towers and institutions like the CBC that had a lock on what was authoritative is gone, and good riddance. But there's still a role for expertise and knowledge, especially for public institutions. We already see this whenever there's a crisis, right? You see this if you're on Twitter, something sudden happens, some kind of crisis happens, and people look to the sources of credible information in those environments. So is there a role for you to be that kind of credibility hub within this noisy data environment? Another thing we want to think about is the role of partnerships. So whether you're in government or academics or business, this extremely fast-moving data environment will thrive on partnerships. So for example, to take what you're developing outside of your educational institution and into the community, to take what you're doing within government and see how it can go out into the community and work with people. Alex Pentland from MIT has talked about what he calls a new deal on data, which is rethinking the relationship between citizens, governments, and corporations that are collecting much of this data. Because if we'd always lived in this world of digital data collection, we would never have come into it with the idea that saying, click, I agree to terms of service that we haven't read is sufficient, right? We would think about ways to bake in privacy and responsible sharing of data from the get-go. And one of the ideas that Pentland and the World Economic Forum have been working on is the idea of a data commons, where we recognize that data has a value to the whole society and that we can have various types of partnerships among governments, corporations, and individuals. For instance, I may be fine with making slews of my data available to researchers or to government or to Health Canada, but not to my insurance company. Corporations like telcos may be willing to share data with city governments, provided none of their proprietary information is shared with the competition. The promise, if we get this environment right, is that we can build more collaborative relationships built on values of partnership and citizenship. A city like Fredericton or a province like New Brunswick can use this data for the benefit of all citizens. That access to data can radically improve people's lives. And that great bottom-up ideas like Ushahidi can create innovative ways of helping our society. But that relies on a reset of the way businesses, researchers, and government think about not only their relationship to each other, but their relationship to citizens and to customers and to clients. Institutions have to get beyond harvesting data and towards being trusted stewards of people's data. But more than that, to a relationship model that understands that what you're doing with data is part of your relationship with citizens. And this is what I mean by the idea of a cultural change in how people see their relationship to data. That just as I expect my Fitbit to give me data to help me look after my health and well-being, I'm going to want that broader range of data that's out there. And we can start to see examples of this kind of data activism based on people recognizing the value of their own data. For instance, there's a case of a San Francisco patient activist named Hugo Campos. Campos wears a pacemaker defibrillator, and he wanted access to his heart rate data so that he could make some decisions about his health. What happened to his heart when he drank too much coffee, or when he went for a run, or whatever, when he meditated. So he went to the company, he asked for his heart rate data, and the company that makes the pacemaker defibrillator said, nope, your heart rate data belongs to us. And so now that's actively making its way through the legal system to try and get access to his heart rate data. So he may be on the bleeding edge of access to data, but he won't be for long. As more and more of us start to realize the value of our data, start producing this data, the more we're going to want to have a say in what's done with it. So there's a chance to build cool stuff and great relationships based on shared values and this incredible platform of data. So if you're a business, what does it look like to give your clients tools that add real value to their lives? Or to, a la Nest, partner with government and citizens to make your community more sustainable? If you're an academic, what are the opportunities to take what you do outside the walls of the institution and into the community? If you're in government, what are the opportunities to build smart cities that don't just harvest data, but that invite the community to partake of the data and be partners with it? Or can you build the next Ushahidi? Remember, 3 people? A platform that brings what you do together with citizens' data to do something truly original and inspiring. The potential for smart cities and data-rich communities is alive with participation, collaboration, and democracy. And I look forward to seeing how you bring your skill and passion to the challenge. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm aware that we're running a little bit behind. So, okay. Does anyone have any questions? Just quickly, and then we can also carry on the conversation during the coffee break afterwards. But if anyone has any comments or questions now, happy to have a listen. There are microphones.
In medicine, there is a concept of informed consent.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of a show that used to be around called House, and they said that patients can never have informed consent because they're just not in the space. They're not spent a lifetime working with medicine. So informed consent is a bit of a facade. Do you think people can have informed consent about how their data is used? I'm just going to leave it at that. Is informed consent possible for public about their own data?
What I think is the problem is that right now we've basically left it up to individuals to say, hey, you take care of this whole, it's up to you to sort things out. So it's your fault if there's a problem with how your data gets used or misused, right? And I think in that sense, the data environment is way too complicated for that to be left up to one person. It's not about whether a person, it's like, what is the context of giving meaningful consent in a world where just going through your day, breathing and walking around means that data is being gathered, right? So that's why I think we need to reset the conversation around, what Pentland identifies as this data commons. So you set the ground rules for what can happen to data. I think that individuals can opt to participate in an informed way, give their consent, but it has to be in the context of this broader set of rules that's very clear. Ian Kerr, who's a researcher at the University of Ottawa in this area, he says he'd like to see this idea that that you can't just click I agree, essentially, that even if your data gets out, or there's a data breach or whatever, there are legal rules around what can happen to your data, right? That clicking I agree doesn't negate all the rules for what can happen to data. And I think that kind of idea is very important, and it's only in that broader context that individuals can give meaningful consent. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, happy to continue the conversation at the coffee break, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Nora. That was very enlightening. I presented Nora with a little gift. We would have done this up here, but she beat me downstairs, so here we are. I was reflecting back on a story I heard many years ago. I started my public service career in Prince Edward Island, and a good friend of mine was a nurse in a nursing home, and this would be in the 80s, and you were talking about Charlotte and the information and how there's two sides to it, and somehow what is said and sometimes what is heard, or sometimes not the same thing. And these two residents in a nursing home, one had severe dementia. She was always spending her days looking for employment. She looked in the newspapers trying to look for employment. So she was looking through the want ads, and she was with someone, and my colleague walked by, or my friend walked by and overheard the conversation. It went like this: oh, look, there's something that you would qualify for. They're looking for someone to do light housekeeping. And the lady with dementia looked at the woman that pointed out the job ad and said, oh, dear God, I've never worked in a lighthouse a day in my life. So there's always two sides to the information. So thank you very much. We are going to be coming back around 10:30. We have two panels that will be moderated. We have one that's going to happen right in this room, Data as a Currency. The other one will be in the governor's ballroom. It's millennial citizenship. I think, Nora, you're moderating the Data as a Currency here in this room. For those of you who are afraid you might miss some of the sessions, they are going to be available to you after the conference. Is that right? And les enregistrants seront disponibles après la conférence. So we'll be back here at 10:30. I would encourage you to take a walk around and look at some of the posters that were submitted as part of the conference activity. Enjoy your coffee, and we'll see you at 10:30. We'll give you about a 2-minute warning, and you better be in here. I'll get the snake eye from poor Lorna here in the corner. Thanks. Enjoy.